Chapter 14 of Tractor Ballet Gone Bad. It was a brief, reasonably secure, and uneventful journey from the knoll to the safety of the barnyard, and en route things began to whirl about in my mind. Ernie's eyes scrunched shut as Todd propelled him across the ice. The ice had been like that earlier when I was half delirious, and Todd was fully delirious. Todd crashing through the ice at the pond and nearly being swept under. The look on Ernie's face as he dropped through the ice that wasn't ice. Todd's clever witticisms. The frozen moment before Todd had latched onto me as the wind swung me out over the black horror. The top of the waterfall breaking off and cascading down where we realized for the first time what real peril we were in. Me on my knees as the far wall of the ravine swayed drunkenly about in my blurry vision when I'd knocked myself out cold. The day's events careened around in my head like a kaleidoscope, and as we entered the barnyard, I began to emit bursts of giggles I couldn't seem to suppress. "Do you want to stop in at the barn on the way by, Todd?" I giggled as Todd struggled with the gate latch. Why would I want to do that?" Todd asked, pushing the gate open. "I don't know," I giggled. "Thought you might want to stop and get warm." "How do you figure anybody's going to get warm in there, Scotty?" Ernie asked as we passed through the gate. "No heat, no livestock in there." "I don't know," I asked Todd. I giggled. He's the one I thought might want to stop in. Whereas to this point I'd managed with some small measure of success to choke back my giggling. I now lost it and just began to plain laugh. "Are you sure you don't want to stop in the barn on the way by, Todd?" I whooped, now laughing madly as Todd pushed the gate shut. "What the fuck?" Todd said, turning to look at me, his face equal parts confusion, concern, and anger. "Are you sure you don't want to stop in at the barn, Tob? Don't want to stop at the barn, Tob?" I shrieked and doubled over, laughing deliriously. "The Sam hell's the matter with him, Todd?" Ernie asked. "Damned if I know, Ernie," Todd replied, latching onto me. "Get a hold of his other arm, he's delirious." Ernie and Todd propelled me across the drive as I laughed manically. No, Tob. Tob wants to stop at the barb. Get warm, I'm delirious. No, not me, Tob, get warm at the barb. Some tiny fraction of my brain was saying, "Get a grip. Man, you're out of control." But the rest wasn't listening, and I just kept babbling manically. Keep a tight hold of him, Todd," Ernie declared as we reached the house. "Tight's about how I'd like to have a hold of his throat about now," Todd growled. "Goats, goats and boats and gobes, boats falling from the sky, Todd." Still laughing like a maniac, delirious fool that I apparently was, we reeled into the kitchen. Todd bowled Ernie aside, propelled me across the kitchen behind a bewildered Diane, plunked me down on the chair beside the stove. Claiming the chair on the opposite side of the stove, Todd sat down and stared at his boots. "Sorry about your floor, Diane," he muttered. Ernie pulled his whiskey jug out of the cupboard, picked up and inspected the contents of his half-filled coffee cup he'd left behind earlier. It didn't seem to his satisfaction. He set it back down, looked about the table, and spying Diane's empty teacup, snatched it up. Ernie poured whiskey into the teacup till it poured over onto the table and tilted it back in one gulp. Diane sat blinking in astonishment as Ernie refilled the cup and tilted it back as well. This time Ernie gave a bit of a gasp and a shudder as the whiskey went down. "Are you okay, Ernie?" Diane asked in obvious befuddlement at the whole scene. "Don't really know for sure, Diane," he replied as he filled his teacup for the third time, sloshing more whiskey onto the table. "The only thing I know for sure," he said, gesturing towards Todd and me, seemingly oblivious to the fact he was sloshing yet more whiskey from the cup all over the table. "It's a miracle these two are alive and sitting here. A miracle. A genuine, bona fide miracle." He tossed back the whiskey and refilled the cup yet again. Diane looked about the kitchen at us. I was a hopeless mess, laughing and shaking. Todd was staring woodenly at his boots, emitting the odd shudder. "Ernie, are you okay?" Diane asked imploringly as he set the whiskey down on the table and turned to look out the door. "I saw the hand of God and the work of the devil in the same place at the same time. I've got to reappraise my thinkin's." "Ernie!" Diane cried. "And then I was a carper," he said solemnly as he stared out the door, now sipping the whiskey. "A carp?" Diane asked. "God, the devil, and then I was a carp." Ernie's voice trailed off as he stood sipping and staring out the door. Diane looked desperately about the kitchen. I was still a hopeless, giggling mess. Todd still staring at his boots, seemingly oblivious to his surroundings. Needless to say, the whole scene was doing little in the way of my getting my shit back together. Diane stared momentarily at her empty teacup saucer, and then to my astonishment, her hand shot out, latched onto the whiskey jug, and she splashed back 2 solid pulls. "Ack," she sputtered, scooting up out of her chair, which spun and landed drunkenly askew against the fridge. She reeled a couple of steps back and ended up against the cupboard counter, sputtering and coughing. "That's vile. How can you drink it?" Ernie snatched the whiskey jug out of her hand and topped up the teacup. "What would possess you to have a belt of whiskey? I don't know, Diane. You never did like it." Todd still sat woodenly. Needless to say, none of this was helping me rein in whatever the hell had a hold of me as I continued to giggle and sniff and cough and whatever. Diane, with her hand balled at her throat, still gasping from the whiskey, tears dripping down her cheeks, looked wildly about the kitchen. Ernie turned and waved the whiskey jug towards me and Todd in a help-yourself gesture as he set it on the whiskey-splashed table and turned back to staring out the door. "You're all scaring me," Diane cried, looking like a spooked horse ready to bolt. "Now, Diane," Ernie said, still sipping and staring out the door, "you know whatever's mine's yours. Always has been that way, always will. But I think you should stay out of my whiskey. Whiskey works for some folks, not others, it seems." A moment or two passed as Diane continued to look wildly about the kitchen. Ernie, immobile at the door but to move the teacup an inch to sip. Todd still mute and wooden. Me still caught in the grip of whatever delirium possessed me. How cold can it possibly be down there?" Diane said. Ding went the clothes dryer timer as the drum wound down to a stop. "Oh, merciful heavens, something I can make sense of," Diane cried as she dashed across the kitchen. "That woman shouldn't drink whiskey," Ernie stated flatly, still staring out the door. Whatever madness had possessed me dissipated as the domestic sounds of Diane fussing about with the washer and dryer spilled out into the silence of the kitchen. Arising from my chair in my delirium, I poured and guzzled some of Ernie's whiskey and poured some into Todd's mug, who accepted it mutely. I poured myself another generous measure. Cup in hand, sipping occasionally like Ernie, I crossed the kitchen and procured another teacup for Diane from the cupboard as Diane peeked out from behind the bathroom and looked about with trepidation. Seeing me fill her cup from the teapot, she sort of scuttled across the kitchen, looking wide-eyed at first Ernie and then Todd en route. "Are you okay, Scott?" she asked me in a small, frightened voice as I spun the chair back from the fridge and she sat down. "Yeah, Diane," I said quietly, giving her shoulder a comforting squeeze. "Sorry about all that. I don't know what possessed me." Diane lit one of her Belvederes with a shaky hand, and as she picked up her teacup, I offered her Ernie's whiskey jug. She managed a small smile and shook her head. I gave her another comforting squeeze on the way back to the chair. Diane's eyes drifted back and forth between Todd, who was still staring at the floor and sipping from his mug, and Ernie, sipping and staring out the door. Her tattered nerves now calmed somewhat, and she said, "Ernie, are you still a fish?" Ernie turned from the door, sat down at the table, and studied Diane for a moment. "Diane, honey, I love you. You know that. but you really should leave the whiskey alone. Todd sat up straight and took a noisy slurp from his mug. It's good whiskey, Ernie, he said. 5-star, Ernie replied. Can't tolerate the cheap stuff. And look here, Diane's got it splashed all over the table. Diane arose from her chair, and as she turned towards the sink to get a dishcloth, she gave me a look that said, "You're taking this in, right?" Todd had another noisy slurp from his cup and, smacking his lips, declared, "Well, it is smooth. Too damned expensive to be splashed all over the table like this," Ernie stated somewhat sourly. Ernie looked up from the table in surprise as the dish rag landed on the table in front of him, to find Diane leaning against the sink with her arms folded. "Clean up your old damn whiskey, you foolish old fish," she barked. Ernie blinked a couple of times with a somewhat shocked expression on his face. "I love you, honey," he said somewhat ruefully as he began to wipe up the table. "But I do wish you'd stay out of the whiskey." 5-star, you say, Todd said with another noisy slurp from his mug. "I gotta remember that. It is smooth." Diane shook her head in bewilderment as she turned to refill the kettle.